The heat of August 1834 pressed down on Savannah, Georgia like a suffocating blanket, thick and merciless. The air itself seemed to rot, carrying the stench of the harbor mixed with magnolia blossoms that had turned brown in the relentless sun. On the corner of Bull Street and Broughton, where the cobblestones still held the day's heat well into the night, a young portrait painter named Thomas Whitmore stood before the wrought-iron gates of Silver Oaks Plantation, his hands trembling despite the oppressive warmth. The invitation had arrived 3 days prior, delivered by a black coachman who would not meet his eyes. The paper was thick, expensive, scented with something Thomas could not quite identify, roses perhaps, but with an underlying note of decay. The handwriting was feminine, elegant and commanding. Mrs. Josephine Blackwood requested his presence at Silver Oaks to paint her portrait. The sum offered was extraordinary, enough to secure his passage to New York and establish a proper studio there. Enough to escape the suffocating social hierarchies of the South that had kept him, the son of a failed merchant, perpetually at the margins of respectability. Thomas had heard whispers about Josephine Blackwood. In the parlors of Savannah, her name was spoken with a peculiar mixture of admiration and unease. She was a widow 3 times over, each husband having met their end in circumstances that were never quite explained satisfactorily. The first, Augustus Fairfax, had drowned in the Savannah River despite being an excellent swimmer. The second, Carlton Merriweather, had fallen from his horse, breaking his neck on what should have been a routine ride. The third, Jonathan Blackwood, had simply never woken up one morning, his face frozen in an expression that the doctor who examined him described as absolute terror, though no cause of death could be determined. Yet Josephine remained untouched by scandal. She was beautiful, wealthy, and possessed of a charm that seemed to disarm even her most suspicious critics. She donated generously to the church, hosted elaborate parties where the cream of Georgia society gathered, and maintained Silver Oaks with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. The plantation produced more cotton than any other in the county. Its fields worked by over 200 enslaved people who, rumor had it, never attempted to run away. Not once in 15 years. As Thomas walked up the oak-lined drive, the evening shadows lengthening across the perfectly manicured lawns, he felt the weight of those rumors pressing against his chest. The house itself was magnificent, a gleaming white Greek Revival mansion with massive columns and wide galleries that wrapped around both floors. But there was something wrong about its perfection. The gardens were too precise, the hedges cut with mathematical exactness, the flowers arranged in patterns that hurt the eyes if one looked too long. Even the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks seemed to drape in identical ways, as if arranged by an obsessive hand. A house slave met him at the door, an elderly woman whose eyes held the blank, 1,000-yard stare Thomas had seen in soldiers who had witnessed too much battle. She took his bag without a word and led him through halls lined with portraits. Thomas, trained to observe such things, noticed immediately that something was profoundly disturbing about these paintings. They were all of men, ranging in age from their early 20s to perhaps 40, and they were all rendered with exceptional skill. But it was their eyes that made his stomach clench with instinctive dread. In each portrait, the subject's eyes held an expression of dawning horror, as if the artist had captured the precise moment when they realized something terrible and irrevocable. Mr. Whitmore, how punctual. I do appreciate punctuality in my guests. Thomas turned, and there she was. Josephine Blackwood stood at the top of the curved staircase, backlit by candlelight that made her seem to glow. She was perhaps 35, with pale skin that appeared to have never known the harsh southern sun, raven-black hair piled in elaborate curls, and eyes of such a deep green they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She wore a gown of emerald silk that would have been more appropriate for a grand ball than receiving a tradesman. but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who made her own rules about propriety. "Mrs. Blackwood," Thomas managed, bowing slightly, "thank you for your invitation. It's an honor to be commissioned by someone of your reputation." "My reputation." Her smile was slow, knowing. "And what exactly have you heard about my reputation, Mr. Whitmore?" "That you are a patron of the arts, that your taste is impeccable." How diplomatic! She descended the stairs with feline grace, her hand barely touching the banister. "And nothing else? No whispers about my unfortunate luck with husbands? No speculation about whether I might be a black widow spinning webs of matrimony and death?" Thomas felt sweat that had nothing to do with the heat begin to form on his brow. I don't listen to gossip, Mrs. Blackwood." "Of course you don't." She stopped 3 steps from the bottom, putting her eyes level with his. Up close he could see that her skin had an almost translucent quality, and there were tiny lines at the corners of her mouth that suggested she smiled often, though perhaps not with genuine warmth. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, what do you think of my gallery?" She gestured to the portraits lining the walls, and Thomas forced himself to look at them again with a professional eye. "The technique is masterful. The use of light and shadow is particularly striking, but the expressions—" "Yes, go on." "They seem captured at an unusual moment. Most portraits show their subjects in repose or with a slight smile. These men look as if they've just received terrible news." Josephine's smile widened. "How observant you are." "That's precisely what drew me to your work, Mr. Whitmore. I saw the portrait you did of young Margaret Winthrop last spring. You didn't flatter her, didn't hide the sadness in her eyes even as she smiled. You painted truth, not illusion. That's a rare quality." "I try to capture the essence of my subjects," Thomas said carefully. "The essence, yes." She descended the final steps and walked past him, close enough that her skirts brushed his legs, and he caught that strange scent again, roses and rot. "Come, let me show you where you'll be working." She led him through the house, pointing out various features with the pride of someone displaying trophies. The parlour with its French furniture and crystal chandelier imported from Venice, the library with its walls of leather-bound books in Greek, Latin, French and English, the dining room with a table that could seat 30 and was never, she mentioned casually, used for fewer than 20 guests. Everything spoke of wealth, in culture and refined taste. Everything except that underlying feeling of wrongness that Thomas couldn't quite articulate. They ended in what Josephine called the portrait room, a large chamber on the 2nd floor with northern-facing windows that would provide excellent natural light. An easel was already set up, along with a table holding paints, brushes, and other materials. All of the highest quality, Thomas noted, but it was the far wall that drew his attention. It was covered entirely with portraits, dozens of them, all of men, all with those same disturbed expressions. "These are all your work?" Thomas asked, unable to keep the shock from his voice. "Oh no," Josephine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I'm no painter. These were done by various artists I've commissioned over the years. You see, Mr. Whitmore, I have a particular interest in capturing a specific moment in a man's life. The moment when he realizes that he is not as free as he believed, that he has in fact been in a cage all along, and the door has just swung shut." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm not sure I understand." "You will," she interrupted, moving to stand before the portraits, running her fingers along the frames with something like tenderness. "Each of these men came to Silver Oaks believing they were the master of their own destiny. Some came seeking my fortune, planning to marry me and gain control of my properties. Some came seeking pleasure, thinking they could enjoy my company and leave unscathed. Some, like you, came for money, for opportunity, for a chance to advance themselves." She turned back to him, and in the fading light, her eyes seemed to glow with their own luminescence. "But Silver Oaks keeps what it claims, Mr. Whitmore. This house, this land, this entire enterprise, it runs on more than cotton and slave labor. It runs on the understanding that freedom is an illusion. The enslaved people in my fields know they're not free. They accept their chains. But men like you, men like these," she gestured to the portraits, "you believe you're free, even as you sell yourselves for money, for status, for approval from people you secretly despise. You're already in chains. You just don't see them yet." Thomas took a step backward, his artist's hands instinctively reaching for his bag. "Mrs. Blackwood, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I should leave. You'll stay for dinner at least, surely." Her voice was pleasant, but there was steel beneath it. It would be terribly rude to leave now. Besides, the gates are locked at sunset. For security, you understand. There are so many desperate people in these times. Runaway slaves, poor whites looking to steal what they can. We can't be too careful. As if to punctuate her words, Thomas heard the distant clang of metal gates closing. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. "Come," Josephine said, taking his arm with surprising strength. "Dinner will be enlightening. I have so much to tell you about the commission, and you haven't even met the others yet." "Others? Why, yes. You didn't think you'd be the only guest, did you? I always entertain several gentlemen at once. It's more efficient that way. Besides, there's something instructive about watching how men behave when they begin to realize their situation. Some become aggressive. Some try to charm their way out. Some simply break. It's fascinating, really, a study in human nature and the myth of masculine freedom." She led him down another hallway, this one lined with windows overlooking the grounds. In the dying light, Thomas could see the slave quarters in the distance, neat rows of small cabins. No smoke rose from any chimney despite the dinner hour. No voices carried across the grass. The quarters looked empty, abandoned, though he knew that couldn't be true. "You're wondering where everyone is," Josephine said, reading his expression. "They're in the fields. We work by moonlight during harvest season. It's cooler, you see, and the cotton doesn't know the difference between sun and moon. Neither do slaves, I've found. They'll work until they drop if properly motivated." The casual cruelty in her voice made Thomas's skin crawl, but it was the matter-of-fact way she said it that was truly terrifying. This was a woman who saw human beings as resources to be used and discarded, no different than the cotton plants, or the portrait subjects, or the husbands who had mysteriously died. They entered a dining room, smaller than the formal one she'd shown him earlier, lit by dozens of candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. At the table sat 3 men, all roughly Thomas's age, all with the same expression of barely concealed panic that Thomas was certain showed on his own face. "Gentlemen," Josephine announced, "may I introduce Thomas Whitmore, portrait artist from Savannah. Thomas, these are your fellow guests, Mr. Henry Ashford, a lawyer from Charleston, Mr. Samuel Pritchard, a banker from Augusta, and Mr. James Whitfield, a cotton buyer from Mobile. We're quite the assembly of professional men, aren't we? All educated, all from good families, or at least families with pretensions to goodness, all seeking opportunity, advancement, fortune." She took her seat at the head of the table, and Thomas found himself mechanically taking the chair a servant pulled out for him. The other men wouldn't meet his eyes. The lawyer's hands were shaking. The banker had a bruise forming on his left cheekbone. The cotton buyer had scratches on his neck as if he'd been clawing at something. Dinner was served by silent slaves who moved like ghosts, placing dish after dish of elaborate southern cuisine on the table. Roasted duck with peach glaze, hoppin' john with rice, collard greens swimming in pot liquor, fresh bread still steaming from the oven. Under any other circumstances, it would have been a feast, but Thomas found he couldn't swallow a single bite. "You're not eating," Josephine observed, delicately cutting into her duck. That's understandable. The first night is always difficult. Mr. Ashford there tried to climb out a window on his first evening, broke his leg in the fall. Fortunately, I have excellent medical resources. He's healing nicely, though I'm afraid he'll walk with a limp. Rather poetic, don't you think? A man trying to escape his fate, only to permanently mark himself with the evidence of his attempt. "Mrs. Blackwood," the lawyer said, his voice rough as if from screaming, "please, I have a wife, children. They'll be looking for me." "They've been notified that you're engaged in an extended legal consultation for a wealthy client who prefers discretion," Josephine interrupted smoothly. "Your wife sends her regards and hopes you'll be home by Christmas, though between us, I suspect she's rather enjoying the break from your company. Your letters reveal a great deal about your marriage, Mr. Ashford. Did you really think I wouldn't research each of you before extending my invitation?" She turned her attention to Thomas. "You, for instance, the son of Marcus Whitmore, who lost everything in a failed textile venture and drank himself to death, leaving your mother to take in sewing to keep you and your sister fed. You worked as an apprentice to old Josiah Green, enduring his drunken rages and wandering hands until you were skilled enough to strike out on your own. You're desperate to make enough money to bring your mother and sister to live with you, to provide them with a respectable life. You'd do almost anything for that opportunity. Wouldn't you, Thomas?" The use of his first name, spoken with such intimate knowledge of his history, made Thomas's stomach turn. She was right. He would do almost anything. But was he willing to do this? To stay in this house of horrors for however long it took to paint her portrait? As if reading his thoughts, Josephine smiled. "You're wondering if you have a choice. Let me be clear. You don't. None of you do. The gates are locked. My overseer, Mr. Graves, patrols the grounds with his dogs. They're trained to kill, and they're very good at their job. The slave quarters are empty because I've sent everyone to the far fields for the next month. There's no one to hear you scream, no one to help you escape. You are, all of you, entirely at my mercy." "Why?" James Whitfield burst out, his voice cracking. "What do you want from us? If it's money, I can pay—" "Money?" Josephine laughed that breaking glass laugh again. "I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. My husbands were all very wealthy and very foolish about their estate planning. No, Mr. Whitfield, I don't want your money. I want something much more valuable. I want to study you. I want to document the precise moment when your illusion of freedom shatters, when you realize that everything you thought you were, independent, strong, masters of your own fate, was a lie." She stood, moving behind each man's chair in turn, placing her hands on their shoulders like a grotesque blessing. "In this country, in this time, we speak endlessly of freedom. Freedom for white men to govern themselves, to own property, to determine their own destinies. But it's all built on the ultimate unfreedom of others. The 200 souls I own work this land, their labor producing the wealth that allows men like you to pretend at civilization. Your freedom is purchased with their bondage. So I ask myself, what is freedom really? And how quickly can it be taken away when the circumstances change?" She returned to her seat, picking up her wineglass and swirling the dark red liquid. "This is an experiment, gentlemen, a study in human behavior and the nature of liberty. You will stay here until I'm satisfied that I've captured the truth of your existence. Some of you will paint, some will write, some will simply exist as subjects of my observation. And when I'm done, when I've thoroughly documented the dissolution of your self-conception as free men, then, well, then we'll see what becomes of you." The room fell silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the sound of Samuel Pritchard beginning to quietly weep. Thomas felt the walls closing in, the candlelight seeming to dim and pulse like the beating of a diseased heart. He thought of his mother, waiting for money that wouldn't come, his sister, hoping for a better life. And he understood with perfect clarity what Josephine meant about chains. He had sold himself, not to a brothel or a factory, but to this woman's sick experiment. And like the enslaved people in the fields, like the husbands who had died mysteriously, like the men whose portraits lined the walls with their expressions of dawning horror, he had no power to break free. "Now then," Josephine said brightly, as if they'd been discussing the weather, "let's talk about the schedule. Thomas, you'll begin painting tomorrow at first light. I want to be depicted in the library, I think, surrounded by books, wearing my emerald gown. We'll do sessions of 4 hours in the morning and afternoon. Between sessions, you'll be free to explore the house, though not the grounds, of course. Mr. Ashford will continue his legal research in the study. I've given him an interesting problem. Is it possible to legally own another human being's future? He's been working on it for 3 weeks now. The paradoxes are delicious. Mr. Pritchard will keep managing my accounts. He's discovered some fascinating irregularities in the estate records of my late husbands. And Mr. Whitfield will continue his inventory of the cotton stores. I'm having him count and recount. He lost count on day 12. We're on day 23 now. I wonder when he'll give up entirely." She raised her glass. "To freedom, gentlemen, that most precious and most illusory of commodities." None of the men raised their glasses. Josephine drank alone, her green eyes reflecting the candlelight like a cat's in the darkness. That first night, Thomas lay awake in his assigned room, listening to the sounds of the house, footsteps in the hallway at odd hours, a man sobbing somewhere below, the distant baying of dogs, and underneath it all, a sound he couldn't quite identify, a rhythmic creaking like a rope swinging in the wind, though there was no wind. He went to the window, pressing his face against the glass. In the moonlight, he could see the oak trees that gave the plantation its name, their branches spreading like skeletal fingers against the sky. And hanging from one of them, turning slowly in the still air, was a body. Thomas jerked back, his heart hammering, and then forced himself to look again. It wasn't a body. It was an effigy, a scarecrow dressed in fine clothes, its head a white sack painted with a man's face frozen in a scream. And beneath it, barely visible in the shadows, sat Josephine Blackwood in a rocking chair, watching the effigy swing, her lips moving as if she were speaking to it. Thomas stumbled away from the window and vomited into the chamber pot, his body shaking uncontrollably. He understood now why the enslaved people never ran away from Silver Oaks. It wasn't loyalty or fear of punishment. It was this, the absolute knowledge that Josephine Blackwood was something beyond the normal cruelties of slavery and Southern society. She was an artist of human suffering, and they were all her canvas. The next morning dawned hot and bright, the previous night's horrors seeming almost surreal in the cheerful sunlight streaming through the windows. Thomas was brought breakfast in his room, fresh biscuits with butter and honey, coffee rich and dark, and then escorted by a silent slave to the portrait room. Josephine was already there, posed in the chair exactly as she'd described, surrounded by leather-bound volumes, her emerald gown arranged in perfect folds. In the morning light, she looked almost ordinary, pretty, but not extraordinary. Just another wealthy Southern belle, playing at culture and refinement. "Good morning, Thomas," she said warmly. "Did you sleep well?" "No," he replied honestly, setting up his easel with hands that still trembled slightly. "I didn't think you would. None of them ever do the first night, but you'll adjust. Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. We can normalize almost anything given enough time." She settled more comfortably in her chair. "Shall we begin?" Thomas mixed his paints mechanically, his mind still full of the swinging effigy and Josephine's vigil beneath it. But as he made the first marks on the canvas, something strange happened. His hand steadied, his breathing regulated. The simple act of creation, of making marks that would become an image, seemed to create a small island of normalcy in the sea of madness surrounding him. "That's it," Josephine murmured, watching him work. You see, art is its own form of freedom, isn't it? For these hours nothing exists except you and the canvas and me. The rest of the world falls away. You're completely absorbed, completely present. It's a kind of escape. It's not escape, Thomas said quietly, mixing the exact shade of green for her eyes. It's collaboration. I'm helping you create your exhibition of horrors. Those portraits on the wall, they're not just documentation. They're trophies, evidence of your power over these men. Very good, Josephine said approvingly. You understand? Yes, they're trophies, but they're also truth. Each of those men came here believing they were free agents, able to make choices and determine their own paths, and each of them discovered that freedom is contingent. It exists only as long as those with power allow it to exist. The moment I chose to take their freedom away, it was gone, just like that. She snapped her fingers. Thomas painted in silence for a while, building up the layers that would become her face, trying to find the essence beneath the beauty. And what he found there chilled him. There was intelligence, certainly. Cunning. A sharp, analytical mind that dissected the world around her with surgical precision. But there was also emptiness, a void where empathy should have been. She looked at people the way a scientist might look at specimens under glass. Interesting, worthy of study, but fundamentally other. You're wondering what made me this way, Josephine said, and Thomas realized he'd been staring at her, brush suspended in midair. Whether I was born without certain feelings, or whether life taught me to suppress them. The answer is both and neither. I had a tutor when I was young, a professor from France who'd fled the revolutions. He taught me philosophy, literature, mathematics, and one day when I was perhaps 14, he told me something that changed how I saw the world. She paused, her eyes unfocusing slightly as she looked into the past. He said that all of civilization is built on the premise that some people are free and some are not. That the freedom of the few requires the unfreedom of the many. Slaves, servants, women, the poor. Their constrained lives create the space for others to imagine themselves as liberated. And he asked me, what happens when someone who is supposed to be unfree refuses to accept that limitation? When a woman, for instance, decides she will be the one who constrains, who owns, who determines the fates of others. So this is about revenge, Thomas asked, against a society that limited your freedom as a woman? Revenge, Josephine laughed. No, Thomas, this is about truth. I'm simply doing what men have always done, using others as resources for my own purposes. The only difference is that I'm honest about it. I don't pretend that slavery is for the slave's own good, or that my husband's died of natural causes, or that you and the other men here are free to leave. I acknowledge the fundamental reality. Power is the only thing that determines freedom, and I have power while you don't. The morning session ended, and Thomas was taken back to his room for lunch. A cold tray was waiting, sliced ham, bread, pickled vegetables, and as he ate, he heard a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, the sound of a scuffle, and then a man's scream cut suddenly short. Thomas went to his door, pressing his ear against the wood. Footsteps approached, and then passed. He waited, counting his heartbeats, before carefully opening the door a crack. At the end of the hallway, he could see two of Josephine's slaves dragging something wrapped in canvas toward the back stairs. The canvas was staining red. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat and quickly shut the door, backing away until he hit the bed and sat down hard. One of them was dead. The banker, probably, or the cotton buyer. Someone had tried to resist, and Josephine had made an example of them. And now there were three. The afternoon session was worse than the morning because Josephine talked throughout, her voice pleasant and conversational as she detailed exactly what had happened. Samuel Pritchard, the banker, had attempted to bribe one of the house slaves for help escaping. The slave had reported it immediately. They always did, Josephine explained, because they understood that her punishments were creative and terrible. Mr. Pritchard had been brought before her, had begged and pleaded, had offered increasingly desperate sums of money, property deeds, everything he possessed. "And do you know what I told him?" Josephine asked, her expression serene as Thomas painted the curve of her jaw. "I told him that he'd just proven my point, that his freedom could be purchased, that it was nothing more than a commodity like cotton or sugar or human flesh, and that having been purchased once, by me, when he accepted my invitation, it could never be truly his again. He didn't understand until the very end. Even as Mr. Graves dragged him to the back courtyard, he was still offering money, still believing that the rules of civilized society applied here. "You killed him," Thomas said, his voice flat. "Mr. Graves killed him. A single shot to the head. Very efficient. His body is being buried in the south field, where all the troublesome ones end up. The soil there is exceptionally rich. The cotton grows higher than anywhere else on the property." Thomas's hand shook so badly he had to put down his brush. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand your situation completely. No illusions, Thomas. No false hope. You're here until I decide otherwise. Your freedom is gone. The only question is how you choose to experience that reality." Mr. Pritchard chose poorly. Mr. Ashford seems to be adapting, accepting. Mr. Whitfield is, well, we'll see. He's still in the angry phase, but that will pass. And you? What will you choose? Thomas looked at her. This beautiful monster sitting calmly in her emerald gown, surrounded by books, and felt something shift inside him. Fear was still there, certainly. Horror at what she'd done, and what she might do. But beneath that was something else. A kind of detached curiosity. She wanted to document the moment when he broke, when his sense of self shattered and reformed into something that accepted captivity. But what if he documented her instead? What if he used this portrait to capture her truth? Not the cultured Southern belle, but the predator beneath. "I'll paint," Thomas said quietly. "I'll give you the portrait you want, but I'll paint it my way, in my truth." Josephine's smile widened. "Good. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Defiance is so much more interesting than immediate surrender. And who knows? Perhaps your truth and my truth aren't so different. Perhaps you'll discover that the act of painting me, of really seeing me, will teach you something about yourself, about what you're willing to do to survive." The days blurred together after that, each one a carefully orchestrated routine designed to normalize the abnormal. Thomas would wake, eat, paint for 4 hours, break for lunch, paint for 4 more hours, then dine with Josephine and whatever remained of the other captives. Henry Ashford, the lawyer with the broken leg, seemed to have genuinely adapted, speaking with Josephine about legal philosophy as if they were colleagues rather than captor and captive. James Whitfield, the cotton buyer, grew increasingly hollow-eyed and silent, disappearing into his own mind as a defense mechanism, and Thomas painted. He painted Josephine with a precision and intensity he'd never brought to a portrait before, capturing not just her physical features but something deeper. The way her eyes held no warmth, even when she smiled. The slight curl of her lip that suggested contempt for everything around her. The elegant hands that had orchestrated so much death. "It's quite good," she said one afternoon in the 3rd week, studying the nearly complete portrait. "Though I notice you've made me look severe, harsh even. Is that how you see me?" "I see you clearly," Thomas replied. "Isn't that what you wanted? Truth instead of flattery? And what truth have you discovered about yourself during our time together? Do you feel less free now, or perhaps more free? The question caught Thomas off guard. How could I possibly feel more free? I'm a prisoner. Are you? Or are you simply experiencing what was always true but hidden? You were never free, Thomas. You were always bound by the need for money, by obligations to your family, by the expectations of society. Here, those obligations still exist, but the pretense is gone. You don't have to maintain the fiction of choice. There's a certain liberation in that, don't you think? Thomas wanted to argue, to reject her twisted logic, but he found he couldn't. Because on some level she was right. The constant anxiety about money, about his mother and sister, about establishing himself in a profession where one's social standing mattered more than talent. It was gone. He had only one task: paint. And in the complete absence of any other choice, there was a strange clarity. "That look," Josephine said softly, leaning forward. "That's the look I've been waiting for. The moment when you realize that freedom and slavery aren't opposites, but points on a spectrum, and we're all somewhere in between. That's what goes in the portraits, Thomas. Not horror at captivity, but recognition of a truth that was always there." The fourth week brought a change in the atmosphere of the house. James Whitfield stopped coming to dinners. Thomas heard him sometimes, pacing in his room, muttering to himself. Henry Ashford grew quieter, his legal discussions with Josephine taking on an almost ritualistic quality. As if by maintaining the forms of intellectual discourse, they could both pretend this was a civilized arrangement rather than captivity. And Josephine herself seemed to be building toward something. She had Thomas paint additional studies. Her hands, her eyes, the drape of fabric over her shoulder. She was creating a portfolio, he realized, a complete documentation of herself at this moment in time. "Do you know what I'm going to do with these paintings?" she asked one morning, as Thomas added final highlights to the main portrait. "I'm going to have them displayed in the parlor, alongside all the others. And I'm going to tell everyone who visits Silver Oaks that you painted them during a month-long residency where I was your patron." Which is true in a sense. I am your patron. You are my employee. The fact that you can't leave is merely an administrative detail. "And what about me?" Thomas asked. "What happens when the portrait is finished?" Josephine tilted her head, considering. "That depends. Have you learned what I wanted you to learn? Do you understand now that freedom is always contingent, always conditional? That the difference between a free man and a slave is simply a matter of whose power you're subject to?" Thomas looked at the portrait on his easel. He'd captured her perfectly. The beauty and the emptiness, the intelligence and the cruelty. But he'd also captured something else, something he hadn't consciously intended. In the way he'd painted the shadows around her, the subtle distortion of the perspective, he'd made her look isolated, alone in her power, separated from humanity by the very things that gave her control over others. "I understand," Thomas said slowly, "that you're as much a prisoner as any of us. Maybe more so, because at least we remember what connection to other people feels like. You've made yourself into something beyond human, and that's the loneliest prison of all." For the first time since he'd arrived at Silver Oaks, Thomas saw something unexpected in Josephine's face. Uncertainty. It passed quickly, replaced by her usual composure, but it had been there. A crack in the facade. "How very perceptive," she said coolly, "and how presumptuous to think you understand me. But perhaps you're right in one sense. Power does isolate. The ability to do anything often means there's nothing left worth doing. It's why I create these little dramas, Thomas. They're the only thing that makes me feel anything at all." "Then you're not studying us to understand freedom," Thomas said, a terrible realization dawning. "You're studying us because you're trying to understand what it means to be human. You've removed yourself so far from ordinary human experience that you don't remember what it's like." Josephine stood abruptly, moving to the window to look out over her perfect, terrible grounds. "The portrait is finished," she said, not looking at him. "You may add your signature tomorrow after that." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its certainty. "After that, we'll see." That night, Thomas lay awake trying to understand what he'd discovered. Josephine Blackwood had created a kingdom where she had absolute power, where she could experiment with human suffering and document the destruction of others' sense of self. But in doing so, she destroyed her own humanity. She was a creature of pure intellect and will, without the connections and limitations that made a person real. In the morning, he went to sign the portrait and found the room already occupied. Henry Ashford stood before the painting, leaning on his cane, studying it with the critical eye of someone trained to analyze evidence. "It's extraordinary," the lawyer said without looking at Thomas. "You've made her look like a demon wearing human skin." "No, that's not quite right. You've made her look like someone who desperately wants to be human, but can't quite remember how." "Has she said what happens to us next?" Thomas asked. Ashford shrugged. "With Whitfield gone?" "Gone? 3 days ago. Hanged himself with his own belt. She had his body buried in that south field she's so proud of. Said it was a waste of potential data, but that suicide was always a possible outcome of the experiment." Ashford's voice was eerily calm, as if discussing a case rather than a man's death. "With him gone, there's only the two of us now. I think she's losing interest. The patterns have been established, the documentation is complete, we're no longer novel." "So what does that mean for us?" Ashford finally turned to look at him, and Thomas saw that the lawyer's eyes held the same blankness he'd seen in the elderly house slave's eyes that first night. The look of someone who had witnessed too much and shut down some essential part of themselves to survive it. "It means we become part of the permanent collection," Ashford said. "She'll keep us here, I think. Not as prisoners exactly, but as staff, curators of her gallery of horrors. We know too much to be released, but we're too documented to be killed. We become part of Silver Oaks itself, as much fixtures as the portraits on the walls or the cotton in the fields." Before Thomas could respond, Josephine entered the room. She looked tired, Thomas noticed. Not physically exhausted, but worn in some deeper way, as if the effort of maintaining her experiments had finally begun to cost her something. "Gentlemen," she said, and her voice lacked its usual steel, "I've been considering the next phase of our arrangement. Mr. Ashford, your legal research has been invaluable. I'd like you to stay on as my permanent counsel. You'll have comfortable quarters, a generous stipend deposited in an account you can access, and the freedom of the grounds, though not, of course, the freedom to leave. Do you accept?" Ashford bowed his head. "I accept." "And you, Thomas?" She moved to stand before the portrait, studying her own image with an expression he couldn't read. "This is a masterwork. You've captured something I didn't know could be captured. I want more. I want you to document this place, these people, this entire enterprise. I'll provide you with everything you need, materials, subjects, time. You'll be my court painter in a sense, recording the reality of Silver Oaks for posterity." "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll join Mr. Pritchard and Mr. Whitfield in the South Field, and I'll find another painter, though it would be a shame. You have real talent, Thomas. You could do important work here, work that tells the truth about power and freedom and the human condition. Isn't that what every artist wants? To create something that matters?" Thomas looked at the portrait, at Josephine's painted face staring back at him with those empty green eyes. He thought about his mother and sister waiting for money that would come. At least now, Josephine would surely pay him if he agreed to stay. He thought about the 200 enslaved people working the cotton fields, their lives constrained by chains, visible and invisible. He thought about the men whose portraits lined the walls, each one documenting the moment when their illusions shattered. And he thought about himself and what he was willing to become to survive. "I'll stay," he said finally. "I'll paint your truth." Josephine smiled, and for just a moment, Thomas thought he saw relief in her expression. "Good. Then let's discuss your first commission. I want you to paint the slave quarters, every cabin, every face, every detail. I want a complete documentation of what freedom's opposite looks like, because that's the secret of Silver Oaks, Thomas. The secret that everyone knows, but no one will say. This entire country is built on one group's freedom, requiring another group's bondage. I'm just honest about it." Over the following months, Thomas painted. He painted the slave quarters with their dirt floors and thin walls. He painted the faces of the enslaved, men, women, children, capturing the resignation and the hidden defiance, the acceptance and the barely suppressed rage. He painted the cotton fields stretching to the horizon, white as far as the eye could see, each bowl picked by hands that would never profit from their labor. He painted Josephine's overseers with their whips and their casual cruelty. He painted the big house with its luxury built on suffering. He painted the graves in the South Field, where Pritchard and Whitfield and others before them lay buried, their lives reduced to fertilizer for the cash crop. And slowly, Thomas began to understand what Josephine had understood all along, that Silver Oaks was not an exception, but a distillation. That the entire social order of the South, of America itself, was built on the principle that some people existed to serve the freedom of others. Josephine was a monster, yes, but she was a monster created by and reflecting the world around her. She kept men as prisoners and called it an experiment in freedom. The South kept millions as slaves and called it the natural order. Both depended on the same fundamental lie, that power determined worth, and that those with power had the right to determine who was free and who was not. Henry Ashford remained at Silver Oaks, working on legal documents that would never be filed in any courthouse, developing theories about property and personhood that existed only in Josephine's library. He seemed content, or at least resigned. He'd found a way to survive by becoming useful, by accepting his role in the machinery of Josephine's world. Thomas painted and tried not to think about his mother and sister receiving money from a source they didn't question, building a better life on funds extracted from his captivity. The irony wasn't lost on him. His unfreedom purchased their comfort, just as the enslaved people's labor purchased the comfort of the Southern gentry. One day, nearly a year after his arrival, Thomas was painting in the portrait room when Josephine entered, carrying a newspaper. She looked shaken, an unusual state for her. "There's going to be a war," she said without preamble. "The northern states are pushing harder against slavery. The southern states are threatening secession. Everyone can feel it coming. The old order is going to burn." "And what will happen to Silver Oaks?" Thomas asked. "That's what I've been considering." She moved to the window, looking out over the grounds she'd ruled so absolutely. "I've spent 15 years building this place into a perfect system, a closed loop of power and control where nothing happens without my knowledge or permission. But systems like this are fragile, Thomas. They only work when everyone agrees to the fundamental premises. Once people start questioning whether slavery is natural, whether power equals right, whether the existing order should exist at all, the whole structure becomes unstable." She turned back to him, and for the first time, Thomas saw something like fear in her eyes. "You're going to paint one more portrait for me. Not of me this time, of Silver Oaks itself. I want you to capture this place before it's gone, because it will be gone, Thomas. One way or another, this world we've built here, this horrible, honest, crystallized version of Southern society, is going to end. And Thomas spent the next 3 months on that final painting. It was the largest he'd ever attempted, nearly 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall. He painted silver oaks in autumn, with the cotton fields white and ready for harvest, the house gleaming in golden light, the oak trees with their branches spreading across the canvas like veins. But he also painted the truth beneath the beauty. In the shadows between the trees, he painted the buried bodies. In the windows of the slave quarters, he painted faces watching the big house with expressions that mingled despair and hope. In the foreground, he painted Josephine herself, tiny against the expanse of her domain, holding a portrait frame empty of any image, as if searching for something she'd lost or never had. When it was finished, Josephine stood before it for a long time without speaking. Henry Ashford joined them, leaning on his cane, and together the three of them studied the painting in silence. "You've made it look like a tomb," Josephine said finally. "Beautiful, but dead. A monument to something that should never have existed." "Isn't that what it is?" Thomas replied. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I suppose it is." That night, Thomas was woken by the smell of smoke. He rushed to his window and saw flames engulfing the slave quarters. But instead of the chaos he expected, he saw order. The enslaved people were moving methodically from building to building, setting fires, and then gathering near the edge of the property with bundles of possessions. And standing among them, directing the operation, was Josephine Blackwood. Thomas dressed quickly and ran downstairs. Ashford was already there, watching from the parlor window as silver oaks began to burn. "She's letting them go," Ashford said, his voice filled with wonder. "All of them. She's giving them papers, declaring them free, supplies for traveling north, and money. She's dismantling her entire enterprise." "Why?" Thomas asked. "Because she finally understood something," came Josephine's voice from behind them. She'd entered the house through the back, smelling of smoke and night air. "Your painting showed me. I built silver oaks to be a pure expression of the South's truth, that freedom for some requires bondage for others, but I built it too well, too clearly. It became obvious that the entire system was insane, that I was insane, that anyone who could look at what we've created here, what I've created, and call it civilization, was mad." She moved to stand before the large painting of silver oaks, now illuminated by the flames visible through the windows. "So I'm ending it. The people who work this land are free now, truly free. The cotton can rot in the fields. The house can burn. Silver oaks will cease to exist." "And us?" Thomas asked. "Are we free?" Josephine laughed, but it was a different sound than her breaking glass laugh from before. This held genuine mirth and genuine sadness. "Were you ever not free, Thomas? You chose to stay in the end. You could have tried to escape 100 times, could have failed and died, or succeeded and fled. But you stayed and painted because part of you wanted to document this place. Needed to, perhaps, just as I needed to create it. We're both artists in our way, you and I. We create truth, even when that truth is terrible." She turned to Ashford. "And you, Henry, you accepted your role so completely that it became real. You're free to go. You always were. The only prison was the one you believed in." Ashford stared at her, and Thomas saw the lawyer's careful composure finally crack. "You're saying this was all... what? A game? An experiment that we could have ended at any time?" "No," Josephine said firmly. "It was absolutely real. The men who died truly. The suffering was genuine. But the moment you accepted it, the moment you stopped fighting, you gave me power over you that I didn't have before. That's the lesson, gentlemen. Power is only real when people believe in it. The moment they stop believing, it vanishes like smoke." She gestured to the burning buildings outside. Those people out there, they're not running away. They're walking, calmly with dignity, because they've stopped believing in the power I had over them. And the moment they stopped believing, that power ceased to exist. The three of them stood watching as Silver Oaks burned. The slave quarters were fully engulfed now, the flames spreading toward the barns and outbuildings. In the distance, Thomas could see the freed people walking down the road that led away from the plantation, carrying torches that lit their way north. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked Josephine. "I don't know," she said, and there was something like freedom in her voice. "For 15 years I've played the role of the perfect Southern mistress, the monstrous matriarch, the collector of broken men. Now that role is ending. Perhaps I'll go north myself. Perhaps I'll find out who Josephine Blackwood is when she's not trying to prove a philosophical point through cruelty." She turned to Thomas. "Take the paintings, all of them. The portraits of the men, the studies of the enslaved people, the final painting of Silver Oaks. Document what happened here. Make sure people understand that this place was both extraordinary and absolutely ordinary. That it was simply the South's truth, painted in clearer colors than most people could bear to see." Thomas looked at the hundreds of paintings in the house, the documentation of suffering and power, and the dissolution of freedom. "It will take weeks to move them all." "Then start tomorrow," Josephine said. "Tonight we watch it burn." They stood together until dawn. Three people who had played roles in a theater of cruelty, watching as the stage itself was consumed by fire. By the time the sun rose over the ruins of Silver Oaks, only the main house remained, smoke-damaged but intact. The fields, the quarters, the entire infrastructure of the plantation was gone. Thomas spent the next month cataloguing and crating the paintings. Josephine helped him, the two of them working side by side in an odd parody of companionship. Ashford left after a week, taking papers that documented his time at Silver Oaks, and declared himself free and clear of all obligations. He was heading to Philadelphia, he said, where he hoped to practice a different kind of law. On the last day, as Thomas loaded the final crate onto a wagon, Josephine gave him a letter. "This is for publication," she said. "A full confession of everything I did here. Names, dates, methods. I want the world to know the truth about Silver Oaks." "They'll call you a monster," Thomas said. "They already do. At least this way, they'll understand why." She smiled, and it was almost genuine. "Besides, I want them to know that what I did here, collecting men, studying suffering, building a kingdom of absolute power, wasn't exceptional. It was just more honest than usual. Every plantation in the South does the same things. I just didn't pretend it was benevolent or natural or ordained by God." Thomas took the letter and added it to his collection. He had hundreds of paintings, dozens of journals, and now this confession. Together, they formed a complete document of Silver Oaks and what it had represented. "What will you do?" he asked Josephine one final time. "I'm going to Europe," she said. "France, perhaps. Somewhere far from the South and its peculiar institutions. I'll live quietly, read philosophy, maybe write, try to be a person instead of a symbol. And if the war comes, if the South falls, then at least I'll have destroyed my own piece of it before the armies did. That's something, isn't it? A small rebellion against the inevitable." They shook hands, an oddly formal gesture after everything they'd been through. Thomas climbed onto the wagon and picked up the reins. As he started down the long oak-lined drive, he looked back once. Josephine stood on the steps of the smoke-damaged house, already looking like a ghost, a remnant of something that had never quite been real. Thomas took the paintings north to New York. He mounted an exhibition called Silver Oaks, A True History, and published Josephine's confession alongside his own account of his time there. The reaction was explosive. Southern papers called him a liar and a traitor. Northern abolitionists hailed him as a truth-teller, but were uncomfortable with his insistence that Josephine's crimes were simply the logical extension of slavery itself. The paintings themselves were too honest for most viewers. The portraits of the broken men were disturbing, yes, but it was the paintings of the enslaved people that caused the most controversy. Thomas had painted them not as victims or symbols, but as human beings, angry, resigned, defiant, despairing, hoping. He'd given them a dignity that the South preferred to deny they possessed. The exhibition was open for 6 months before a group of Southern sympathizers broke in one night and destroyed dozens of paintings. But Thomas had made engravings of the most important pieces, and these circulated widely, becoming part of the abolitionist propaganda in the years leading up to the Civil War. He never saw Josephine Blackwood again. He heard rumors that she'd gone to Paris, that she'd died of consumption, that she'd been seen in London living under an assumed name, but nothing confirmed. She'd vanished as completely as Silver Oaks itself had burned. Thomas went on to have a successful career as a painter, always working with the same meticulous attention to truth that had characterized his time at Silver Oaks. He married, had children, and tried to build a life that had meaning beyond documenting suffering. But he never forgot those months in Georgia, and he never stopped trying to understand what Josephine had been trying to teach him about freedom and power. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, Thomas was 45 years old. He volunteered as a war artist, documenting battles and military camps with the same unflinching honesty he'd brought to his paintings of Silver Oaks. And in every army tent, in every field hospital, in every moment of suffering he witnessed, he saw the lessons of Josephine's experiment playing out on a continental scale. The war was about slavery, yes, but it was also about the nature of freedom itself, about who got to be free, and at what cost, and whether a nation could be built on the premise that some people's liberty required other people's bondage. In 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg, Thomas found himself painting the wounded in a field hospital. A young soldier, barely 20, lay dying from a stomach wound. In his final moments, as morphine took away the pain, he looked at Thomas with an expression Thomas had seen before. On the faces of the men in Josephine's portraits, on the enslaved people at Silver Oaks, on Josephine herself in that final painting. It was the look of someone realizing that freedom was more complicated than they'd ever imagined, that it could be taken away or given, that it was fragile and conditional, that entire systems of power existed to determine who deserved it and who didn't. "Paint the truth," the young soldier whispered, his hand reaching for Thomas's arm. "Don't let them make it pretty. Don't let them make us heroes or martyrs or anything except what we were, scared boys dying for an idea we barely understood." Thomas painted. He painted the truth. And when the war ended and the enslaved people were freed, and the nation began the long, painful process of trying to live up to its ideals about liberty and justice, Thomas's paintings served as a reminder of the cost of building a nation on slavery, the cost of fighting to end it, and the cost of the compromises that followed when freedom turned out to be not a simple gift, but a complicated negotiation of power and privilege that would take generations to properly sort out. He died in 1899, an old man who had lived long enough to see Reconstruction rise and fall, to see the promise of freedom extended and then systematically undermined, to watch as new forms of bondage replaced the old ones. His final painting, done when he was nearly 80 and his hands shook too badly to hold a brush steady, was of Silver Oaks as he remembered it on that last night. The house stood intact while everything around it burned, and in the window of the portrait room a tiny figure stood watching, Josephine or Thomas, or perhaps both of them. It was impossible to tell, bearing witness to the end of one world and the painful birth of another. The painting was titled simply Freedom's Cost, and beneath it Thomas had written a quote from Josephine's confession: "We are all, every one of us, both prisoner and jailer. The only question is whether we have the courage to acknowledge which role we're playing at any given moment, and whether we're willing to change it." It hangs now in a museum, a curiosity from a troubled time, viewed by people who live in a world transformed by the war that painting helped precipitate. They look at it and think they understand. They see the South's sins, the tragedy of slavery, the price of freedom. But very few of them see what Thomas saw, what Josephine tried so desperately to make people understand through her terrible experiments at Silver Oaks: that freedom is never absolute, that it always comes at someone's expense, and that the true horror is not that some people are enslaved, but that we're all complicit in systems of power that constrain and define us, and that we mostly lack the courage to acknowledge this truth, much less try to change it. Silver Oaks is gone now, burned to ash in 1859. The land was never replanted, never rebuilt. It stands empty, a square mile of Georgia that produces nothing but wild grasses and the occasional oak tree sprouting from the ruins. Local people say it's haunted, that on certain nights you can see lights in the windows of a house that no longer exists, hear music from parties that ended before the war. But Thomas knew the truth. Silver Oaks wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the living, by everyone who benefited from the system it represented, by everyone who looked away from the truth of where their freedom came from, by everyone who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The real horror of Silver Oaks wasn't that it existed. It was that it was honest about what it was, and that honesty was more terrifying than any supernatural tale or Gothic invention could ever be.